If there is one weapons class that is misunderstood more so than any other, it's gotta be pistols. Some people think they're easier to handle than a rifle. Some people think they're completely useless. Video games and films have definitely tampered with our understanding of this weapons platform, and today I want to rectify a lot of the confusion when it comes to pistols. Before I start sending facts your way though, let me talk about my experiences with pistols. I've always been fascinated with pistols ever since I was a kid. I mean, come on, I grew up playing Halo Combat Evolved, and if that doesn't get you into pistols, I don't know what will. So let me list some of the pistols that I fired and my thoughts on them. I have some experience with the SIG P22-6. It's most notably featured in the Angel Has Fallen series or Olympus Has Fallen series, and it is Gerard Butler's main gun in that film. While I liked the trigger and the lightweight, I found that it kicked a little too much for my taste, seeing that it was firing 9mm. The handgun I have the most experience with would be the Glock platform. The Glock 17, 34, 21, and 19 have all graced my hands on many occasions. While I've shot many different types of guns, the Glock platform is probably the one that I've had the most training with. Training referring to drills and focusing more so on speed and accuracy rather than just having a good time. The Beretta has shown up in a lot of films and video games. You probably already recognize it without me having to name it. Now, in regards to my thoughts on the Beretta, I think it's the most smoothest shooting gun that I've ever fired. Fun fact, I've never fired a 9mm version of it, only versions in .40 Smith & Wesson, which many people say kicks a lot more, but with the Beretta, it felt as smooth as a 9mm. If you've played a video game, you know the 1911, the classic .45 ACP handgun. This was used by the US military back in World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. If you've watched some of my videos, then you already know my thoughts on it. I'm not a big fan of it because of the kick, and because this is the only handgun I've ever had jam up on me, so I'm not a big fan of its reliability. And a quick search on YouTube in terms of reliability tests comparing different pistols, the 1911 never really makes that much of an impression in terms of being there when the going gets tough. And then the last gun is perhaps my least favorite. It's the Smith & Wesson Model 5906, I think it's called. Anyways, I shot this while I was abroad. It was used by security contractors before they switched over to Glock, and they handed it to me just to show me how much of an improvement the Glock was, and oh my god. This handgun here shot lead back into my face, kicked like crazy, and was obnoxiously heavy. So if you're in the market looking for a handgun and you're looking for a 9mm, don't grab this Smith & Wesson. Don't. So now that we talked about the different pistols that I have had experience with, let's talk about different types of pistols generally. Similar to the shotgun video, we're going to go through the 3 most common types, break them down, and talk about their different uses, drawbacks, and benefits. First up, we have single action pistols. Now this is probably the oldest category we're going to be going over today. With a single action pistol, the way it operates is that you manually have to pull back the hammer that's normally located towards the top of the pistol, and then as you pull the trigger, the hammer will go, hit the round, and fire it. However, it will not reset itself. Before you can pull the trigger again, you need to manually pull back that hammer again and fire. You will need to do this for every shot. Normally, single action guns come in the form of revolvers. However, there are some examples of magazine-fed pistols operating in a similar fashion. For example, the 1911 is single action and double action. We'll talk more about double action right in a bit. However, for now, the 1911, upon the first shot that you fire, you must manually pull back the hammer. It'll reset itself after, but for every first shot, the hammer must manually be cocked back. After that first shot though, it becomes double action, as I said before. Now, a double action pistol is a pistol where you don't have to manipulate the hammer whatsoever. You put in your magazine, you charge it into battery, and you can just continuously fire in semi-automatic fashion without having to worry about cocking that hammer back. However, with this increased fire rate comes the drawback of having a harsher trigger pull. Now, because it resets itself, it requires you to pull on that trigger a little bit harder to force the hammer back before it fires. So when you pull the trigger on a double action handgun, what happens is you start putting pressure on the hammer, it reaches a breaking point, and then it fires forward. And then you can just keep doing that over and over again simply by operating the trigger. Now, a single action handgun will always have a lighter trigger because you've already pulled the hammer back. Now, with most double action handguns, you can actually pull the hammer back if you want to have a lighter trigger pull. So while I wouldn't recommend this if you're trying to fire many rounds in quick succession, if you're trying to take a more accurate shot, you can pull back that hammer and then not worry so much about the trigger tension that you would normally be facing. Next up, we have striker-fired handguns. Now, if you thought the double-action handgun had a heavy trigger pull, it's even heavier here. These guns operate by having a pin on the inside of the gun that uses pressure from the trigger to fire a round. Now, this is a very reliable system. However, like I said, the trigger is extremely heavy and is usually fired in 2 stages. You'll pull the trigger and reach kind of what functions as a safety, where the handgun is now ready to fire. Then you pull that trigger back even more, and then the gun will fire. The most popular example of a striker-fired handgun that I can think of, and that most could think of, is the Glock. The Glock uses this system to keep its gun sealed off from the elements, which makes it very reliable whether you're in sand, mud, water, or dirt. The reliability of striker-fired handguns have made them center stage right now in terms of what people are buying and, more importantly, what militaries are adopting. For example, the US military recently adopted the SIG P320 as their new 9mm handgun. Now, this handgun has received some flack because unlike the Glock, which has its safety built into the trigger, this striker-fired handgun has a manual safety mounted onto the gun. This has caused some issues as without a safety mounted within the trigger, striker-fired handguns can go off if you hit them too hard against something or drop them. So because the SIG P320 doesn't have a safety based in its trigger, it can go off when you don't want it to. So that can be seen as a drawback to striker fires. You really need to have a heavy trigger for them to be reliable and safe. Now let's talk about some of the calibers that pistols take. First up, we'll go over 9mm. This is the most popular type of handgun ammunition. It doesn't have a lot of recoil, you can store a lot of rounds in there, and it allows you to put a lot of rounds down in quick succession. It is not the most powerful caliber out there, however, it's seen as good enough for most situations. You may have to pelt more than one round to put a human being down, however, it works for most self-defense scenarios. 9mm is always going to be a practical choice of ammunition as it's abundant all across the globe. Next up, we have 45 ACP, which tends to be more popular among the older generations. Those of you who are into guns will know why it's fun to make fun of 45 ACP. But anyways, the 45 ACP is slower than the 9mm, however, it hits much harder. It's much more likely that you'll be able to put a human being down in one shot with a 45 ACP. However, the round is larger, which means you can carry around less ammunition, and it kicks quite a bit, which means being accurate and firing shots in quick succession can be difficult with this round, which hampers its practicality. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you have what's called mouse calibers. This usually comes in the form of 380 ACP or 22 long rifle. These are incredibly small rounds that allow for guns to be packaged very tightly, so it's perfect for concealed carry. It's virtually, you feel no recoil. However, you don't really do a lot of damage with these rounds. Statistics show that even after an entire mag of 22 long rifle or 380 ACP, a human-sized target can continue to move. However, there are some who have injuries or who aren't very familiar or comfortable with firearms, and these mouse calibers are a good place to start. A lot of people also use these calibers for training, as you don't have to deal with recoil and they're incredibly cheap. Lastly, we're going to go over what I like to classify as wrist breakers. Now this is going to be 44 Magnum and 50 Action Express. These rounds are insanely big and ridiculous, honestly, to put into a handgun. While they have the potential to tear a limb off when you fire them at a human-sized target, they kick so much that successive fire isn't really a practical option, and your hands are really going to hurt after shooting these. So I wouldn't recommend them or call them practical. Now that we've discussed the different ways that handguns can operate, as well as different calibers that they can take, let's talk about what a sidearm is supposed to be in reality. How is it supposed to work? What purposes do they fulfill? And who uses them? And why? In regards to a sidearm's purpose, it's all in the name. A sidearm isn't supposed to be the gun that you rely on in intense combat scenarios. It's supposed to be your secondary. It's something you can always keep at your side. It's a maneuverable package that's going to be there no matter what. It's not going to be the best for any particular situation, but when you have nothing else, you can draw it and you can rely on it. You're not going to have the range of a rifle, the comfort of a rifle, or the power of a rifle. However, the fact that you can take this thing wherever with you in a relatively small, large, whatever you want kind of package, it's always going to have a place. With that being said, let's talk about some of the places that sidearms can be found and the people that carry them. In the military, sidearms are given to officers or soldiers that fulfill a very specific role. For example, Air Force pilots are usually issued pistols, as if their plane crashes, they can't fit a rifle or shotgun in the cockpit with them, so they normally have a sidearm there in case they go down and in case they need to defend themselves. Truck drivers and other machine operators also carry sidearms, as again, they're in confined spaces and can't really be carrying much else. Sidearms are also given, as I said before, to officers as a symbol of status. Police officers and security guards are often issued sidearms, as normally within their line of work, heavy firepower is not really needed. So if something breaks out or if a tense situation happens, normally a sidearm will fulfill the roles they need it to fulfill. Also, carrying a larger weapon in public spaces, where it isn't really militarized or things like that, might make people uncomfortable, so sidearms are easier to hide and keep low profile. Sidearms are also extremely popular among civilians for personal protection. It's much easier to keep a sidearm in your car, in your jacket, or tucked away in a holster in your pants than a rifle and or shotgun. It's something discreet that you can still rely on if shit hits the fan, but you can still go about your day-to-day life without freaking people out or having to carry something obnoxiously heavy. Pistol caliber rounds are also among the easiest to effectively suppress, making sidearms very popular among special forces or other people who want to keep a very low profile while firing their weapon. So now that at this point you have a generalized knowledge of how sidearms work and their function, why don't we start going into the misconceptions that video games and film put in our heads? The first and most popular misconception is the bigger the bullet, the better the gun. Now, we went over before how high calibers tend to make you a little more inaccurate and hurt your hand and tend to be much more heavier, harder to maneuver packages. So in most cases, it's actually smarter to have a smaller bullet or a smaller round so you yourself can be more accurate and efficient with your pistol. Misconception number 2, it takes an entire magazine to kill. Video games more often than not portray pistols as incredibly weak. I'm thinking some of the guns in Far Cry, the 1911 from Snake Eater, and a lot of guns inside of Call of Duty. They tend to have it so that you have to empty an entire magazine out into an enemy to kill them. This makes pistols look a lot weaker than they are. While pistols are nowhere near as strong as shotguns or rifles, they do hold their ground. You will put someone down when you fire a couple rounds. I'd say like with a 9mm, if you're getting horrible shots, maybe 3 shots maximum. However, you're not going to need the entire magazine to take one person out if you hit everything on target. Misconception number 3, they're easier to handle than rifles. Now, many people think because pistols are smaller that they're going to kick less and be a lot easier to handle than a rifle, so a lot of people tend to try to start off training with pistols. This isn't the case. Pistols are among the hardest guns to train to work with under pressure, as the smaller package means you'll have it kick more because there's less mass, it'll move around a lot more in your hands, and it doesn't have the improved ergonomic comfort of a rifle. So with a handgun, you need to train a lot more to be effective than if someone were to hand you an AK or AR. Lastly, we have misconception number 4, that suppressors equal absolute silence. Now here's the thing. Yes and no. It really depends on the caliber that you're shooting as well as the suppressor. For example, subsonic 9mm can realistically be used for stealth in a pistol setup. Not so much if you're in a small square room with like 2 people in front of you, you shoot one of them in the back, the other one's gonna hear it. However, if you're crawling around in the density of a jungle with a cacophony of wind, animal noises, and other ambience, people might not hear the shot that you fire. Again, it depends on the round. For example, the Metal Gear series features these weird little trank guns, which are modified 9mm, that have so little powder that they don't even manually eject themselves. Snake will have to manually rock the slide backwards to eject a round. This means, while it's annoying to pull that shit back, it's gonna be a lot more quiet than a standard 9mm being fired out of a suppressor. So again, depends on the gun, the caliber, the configuration, and the suppressor. But to an extent, you can rely on a pistol to be silent. Most of the time though, suppressors are just used to protect your own hearing. In conclusion, pistols are great. Video games and films tend to warp our perceptions of them and either make them seem really cool in the wrong ways or really shit in the wrong ways. But the reality of it is, whether you need a tool for self-defense, are an officer showing your status, or just need something for your specific task, if you're down on your luck and injured and can't have something that's too big or heavy to carry, or if you just need something to be there no matter what happens, a sidearm has got your back. So, with that being said, I'm Pliskin, and I can proudly say that pistols, ever since I was a kid, have been my favorite type of weapon. And now that I've learned about guns, now that I've trained with firearms, now that I'm pursuing firearms as a passion, I can say with certainty that even back then, before I knew anything, I had good taste. Anyways, this has been Pliskin. Do you guys have any pistols that you like in real life or in a video game? I want to hear about them. So let me know down in the comments below. Anyways, hope y'all are staying safe during quarantine, during this crazy pandemic.